We were the kids that were supposed to get picked up and never got picked up. As simple as that. She loved him to death, and if he said he was gonna be there and didn't show up, that would crush her.
My father wasn't around as a father should be. So my Uncle Jermaine definitely played a big role as my father figure.
A list of names was handed to the security guards at a gated home in the hills. The instruction was clear and final. Certain people were not to be allowed through. One of the names on that list belonged to a man who had grown up inside the same family as the woman living there. Not a stranger, not an outsider, a brother. How does someone go from performing on the largest stages in the world to being barred from the place where his own mother lives? What sequence of choices, losses, and collisions produced that particular kind of exile? And why did the quietest chapter of his public life turn out to be the one that left the deepest fractures? If you want the complete weight of the stories that usually get reduced to footnotes in the larger family legend, subscribe right now. Most people who continue without that step never return for the chapters that actually explain how the center failed to hold. This channel stays with the full sequence rather than the polished summary. One click keeps you inside it. He was the youngest of the brothers, born after the original group had already begun to form. While the older five were learning the machinery of performance under an exacting father, he was still a small child absorbing the life from the sidelines. The road became his early classroom. Piano and percussion came first. A Christmas performance for blind children at age 11 offered a first taste of the stage. When one brother chose to remain with the original label rather than follow the others, the opening appeared. He stepped into the lineup. The group name changed. The work continued. For the better part of a decade, he functioned as a contributing member of one of the most visible acts in popular music. He played on the records that followed the Motown years. He received a Grammy nomination for work on one of those albums. He wrote and co-produced material. He performed through the massive tour that still ranks among the largest of its kind. The identity was clear. He belonged to the unit. Then the unit ended. The final group album arrived. The collective activity stopped, and a man not yet 30 was left to invent a self that no longer depended on the shared name and the shared schedule. The first attempts at reinvention moved quickly. A new band was formed. A record was released. Critical notices were mixed, but not dismissive. Timing, however, worked against it. The same label was pouring resources into a sibling's career-defining project. Corporate transitions buried the smaller release. The band dissolved. The familiar path of trying to convert group fame into solo momentum had closed. What followed was less expected. He turned toward technology. In partnership with a former musician who had become an engineer with a background in guidance systems, he co-founded a company focused on early video compression for CD-ROM. In an era before the formats that later became standard, the venture claimed advances that could place full-motion video on a single disc. For a brief window, the former performer was operating at the edge of a developing medium. Then the partner disappeared. A van left for a meeting and never arrived. A final disoriented phone call, years of uncertainty followed by the discovery of remains in a remote canyon. Investigators ruled the death a suicide that had occurred the night of the disappearance. The company never recovered its momentum. The technological chapter closed under circumstances that were both public and unresolved. Personal life during the same stretch carried its own volatility. A short marriage ended in divorce after charges of battery involving the spouse and a young child. A no-contest plea, probation, and a court-ordered program followed. Other relationships during the period were marked by similar patterns of conflict that reached public attention through accounts circulating in entertainment circles. Financial pressure compounded the instability. Bankruptcy filings, an arrest warrant related to undelivered assets, and a later federal guilty plea for failing to disclose a vehicle during the original proceedings placed a member of one of America's most famous musical families in the position of defending incomplete paperwork in court. The contrast with the earnings associated with other siblings was stark. Running underneath these public and private disruptions was a deeper entanglement that would surface repeatedly for decades. A relationship that began while he was still married produced 2 children. After the divorce, the connection continued. Then the mother of those children formed a new relationship with one of his brothers. The discovery produced a rupture that never fully closed. Marriage followed between the former partner and the brother. The children grew up inside a rearranged family structure. Informal arrangements about support and living circumstances, made in the complicated proximity of shared wealth and shared addresses, later became the subject of prolonged legal action when decades of unpaid obligations and accumulated judgments came due. Lawsuits, competing claims about what had been provided in kind versus what was owed on paper, and the permanent emotional distance between two brothers who had once performed together formed a knot that outlasted any single court date. The death of the most famous brother in 2009 intensified every existing fracture. Questions about the validity of the will, the authority of the named executors, and the proper role of the surviving siblings produced years of public conflict. Accusations of mismanagement and exclusion were leveled. One particularly charged statement expressed fear for the matriarch's well-being under the existing arrangement. The tension reached a visible peak in the summer of 2012 when several siblings arrived at the residence where the mother and the 3 children were living. Accounts of an attempt to remove the children led to a law enforcement investigation and a temporary shift in guardianship. Security instructions followed. Specific names, including his, were placed on a list of people not to be admitted to the property. The man who had once performed for presidents and packed stadiums was, by explicit order, locked out of the home where his mother lived. Some of the formal legal objections were later withdrawn. Guardianship arrangements were adjusted. Public appearances of family unity occurred at intervals, yet the underlying separations proved durable. Parallel to these conflicts, he found steadier professional footing in later years by supporting a sister's career, helping manage business affairs during a difficult personal period for her, and co-founding an independent label that released new material under her name. The role was supportive rather than central, a reversal of the earlier pattern in which a sibling's success had overshadowed his own efforts. The arc that began with a child watching from the wings of an already famous act and ended with formal exclusion from a family residence is not a simple story of decline. It is a sequence of attempts to construct an identity after the original structure dissolved, each attempt complicated by financial pressure, personal volatility, unresolved betrayals, and the gravitational pull of a legacy that no single surviving member could fully control. The music stopped. The consequences did not. What remains is the image of that list handed to the guards. A name that once appeared on album credits and tour posters now appeared on a security directive. The distance between those two documents measures more than the passage of years. It measures the cost of trying to live outside a machine that had defined every earlier chapter and the particular difficulty of doing so when the machine was also a family. The quieter brother after the music stopped did not disappear. He simply discovered that the stages that remained were smaller, more contested, and far more permanent in their damage.